Alright, so it's been a couple weeks since I posted a video. Air Force sent me on one last TDY before I retired. We were supposed to be in Italy for 5 days. Plane broke as soon as we landed and we couldn't get the part. We were there for 10 days. And then I got sick on the way home, and then, the weather was bad and so on and so forth. But today it's nice. I'm finally out here working in the shop. So the Jaggernaut here needs a little bit of a back step. I'm going to go ahead and work on the wiring today, but the engine's got to come back out of it. I want to turn the engine over to put the torque converter bolts in it, and I got the engine turned about halfway around and it stopped. I think the dipstick is, I tested the dipstick, made sure it spun everything over and it cleared, but now all of a sudden it's not. And I think the dipstick is slightly in the way of the crankshaft. It's getting pinched between the crank and the side of the block. So I'll pull the engine back out of it sometime here in the next couple of weeks and see what I can figure out on that. But for today, I'm going to work on wiring, since that's what I've been working on. I want to continue a little bit on that. So, time to get to it. I haven't actually got started on doing any more wiring yet. I've actually been working on getting some of this a little better. I ran this wire last time, and I like how it's going, but I need a little more slack at the back. It was kind of pulled away from the tail lights. Right here, this corner wasn't this tight. It was kind of hanging out here, and that's kind of crap. I want it tucked up nice and neat. So I pulled more of this line through here to have a little more slack, and I gave a little more green wire to the fuel pump here so I can tack this down how I like it. And so that's part of, you take 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes when you're doing stuff like this, and especially wiring. When you're laying out an all-new wiring harness from scratch, you're going to do a lot of forward and back. And to that end, this run here was twisted, so the split in the seam here wrapped around and around and around, and so I've turned this now to where the seam's all facing outward all the way down the run, and I pulled this wire down a little bit lower. Gonna get it in frame here. I pulled it down a little bit lower. It was kind of coming across up here higher, but I wanted it down here with this battery cable, and I think that's a little neater. I do need to pull a little bit, there we go, a little bit more through. And so whenever I get this back up in there, I'm going to make sure the seam all goes the same way, and then I'll be able to continue on with wiring from the fuse box to the relays and out. Took a moment to go get some hardware. All these switches have screws. None of these are blade terminals. In my experience working on age equipment for the Air Force, the Dash 86 generators have terminal boards with just rows of spade terminals, and we've had a lot of problems in recent years where we'll go to troubleshoot a generator, and as you're troubleshooting, the symptoms keep changing. And recently we had one of those, and I told the airman working on it, I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to start on one end of this terminal board, pull every single wire off one at a time, crimp it tighter, and put the spade terminals back on. And we did that, and it narrowed it down to like 2 problems that this generator had. But you know, we've had just multitudes of problems, and the symptoms kept changing. So I don't like spade terminals so much, and so that's why on the switch gear here, these are all screw-on. You can see there's a flathead here on the end one, and all the rest are Phillips. I'm going to get rid of these flathead screws. I'm probably going to replace the switch. It's a little, you can see it's got a longer throw on it. I'm not really crazy about that switch. I'll probably pull that one out and replace it. But on the push button start switch, it had 2 flatheads on it, and so I went to my bolt bin and found a couple of Phillips heads. And so I want my hardware to match. I want to be able to, you know, I'm not expecting to find flatheads anywhere. Flathead screws they're pretty garbage. For the most part, I don't like using them. I'm not sure why I tolerated having flatheads on here previously, other than the fact that maybe I just didn't want to have to find some more hardware for it at the time, and I was in a hurry. So I've got some Phillips head screws on here now to hold the wires on. These are all Phillips heads, so I'm going to get back to putting this back together. The wires I ran a little while ago with the 2 gray wires, that's your start switch wires. There's no polarity to a start switch, so basically you can run either wire to either terminal, so you know, no matter what. Basically there's a wire that comes down from the fuse box to the start switch. That's going to carry the power to the start switch, and then after the start switch, the power is going to go out to through the firewall to the starter. It's a fused circuit, so should be good to go at that point, and we'll see how it goes. The downside to having screw terminals instead of spade terminals is you can't just pull a wire off and put it back on. To pull a wire off one of these, I pretty much have to pull this panel up out of the way, and you know, if it's one of these screws here, I'm going to have to rotate the switch in order to be able to get a screw on it. So that's the downside of using the ring terminals, but they're much more secure. All right, so if you notice there, I don't know how well you can see with this battery cable in the way. Let's see if we can tuck that up there. If you notice, when I was wiring this, I've got the wires daisy chained here. This gray wire up here, actually we can change those fuses. It's going to be a 20 amp fuse feeding this. Anyways, this gray wire up here on the top comes down and it feeds the start switch. And so the start switch is not polarity sensitive right up until I use it as a starting point for the daisy chain of power to the rest of these switches. So you can see I run the gray wire here, then it goes along and provides power to every one of these switches. And that's what I have in my wiring diagram. One wire comes in, feeds this whole panel, and that's the wire to the start switch. So I've got, once I decide that I'm going to daisy chain it, then polarity matters. I can't have my power coming in on the back side of this. If I have the daisy chain on the opposite side of where the power comes in, that means the daisy chain only gives power when I hit the start switch. So whatever terminal you use to bring the power into the circuit, that's the one you've got a daisy chain on. And then the wire that goes from the start button to the engine, that one is going to be on the downside leg of the switch. So this is wired up now as far as the start switch and the power coming in. So now I've got to run the individual circuits from these switches out to where they go on the car. And the next one I'm probably going to do is going to be the next one further that way, the ignition switch. And that is supposed to be gray and yellow. So I've got my box of wiring here. Let me find my gray and yellow wire. And I've got it. And I also have a pigtail that I cut. I'm not sure, I did this Deutsch connector a couple years ago. I did a video on it. You can go back and see if you can find it. I think it's the second how to wire your car cheaply video I did. I did this pigtail, and this is not going to be long enough to get from this switch all the way to the distributor. It's not, I don't know that it's going to get far enough through the firewall to even really do what I want to do. So I think I'm going to ignore this bit here and run a new wire out the firewall. And you can see this is far thinner wire. I don't have any of the, oh yeah, I do. Well, let's run outside. This is 18 gauge. The wire that I ran down here to the switch panel is 12 gauge. So I think that so long as I'm not using the start switch, I'll be able to run current through all the rest of these without a problem. The start switch is only going to be momentary, so when I do hit the start switch, it's not going to pop a fuse, even if I'm drawing stuff on the other circuits. But anyways, so let me get this. I'm going to go to the other side of the firewall. I'm going to feed this wire in, and I'm going to run it down through my little, I don't know if you notice I put some more of these hoops here to contain the wiring and get it nice and neat. So I'm going to run this wire through these loops. Alright, so I have most of the control panel done here, and I went to wire the accessory circuit switch, And I realized on my wiring diagram, I only have specified white wire for both the control and the load side of the circuit. I don't like that. I don't want to run 12 gauge white wire to the control side and have somebody mess it up and get confused with the load side and end up drawing too much amperage through the little fuses here, or through the circuit panel. So for my accessory circuit, I'm going to run a 12 gauge white wire directly to it from the fuse block, but I'm going to run a separate control wire of a smaller gauge from the switch up to the accessory. I don't have that wire yet, so temporarily I have this white and purple wire I just pulled out of the old harness, and I'm going to use it just for wiring it up. And I think I'm going to put in an order for some more. I'll probably go with white and black, just because that's a very simple wire color, easy to see the difference. And I think that's what I'm going to use for a control wire on this part of the circuit. So anyways, now I've got to run this one. I don't know if you noticed, there's multiple wires on some of these. The fuel circuit, I've got the fuel pump and the fuel gauge wired here. The fuel gauge wire is going to come up and go over here, this stuff, to the dashboard, and the fuel pump is going to come up to a relay. So my gauges I don't have sorted yet. I don't have gauges yet. The fuel pump, or the fuel gauge, is probably not going to get wired up anytime soon. I don't have a provision for a fuel gauge on the fuel cell. That's one of those things I want in the future. I do want to put a fuel gauge on it. The fuel pump control wire I need to run up here. Now I'm going to put another one of these, a couple of these clamps here. I'm going to put one here and then one here, and that way everything can run up there. But I don't have that yet. So here's my accessory circuit control wire I'm going to run up there. And again, this is just going to be a temporary wire. I'm going to cut that back. That looks a little tarnished there. Let's see if I can get some good wire. See, it's not bright and coppery. It's, I don't know if you can see, but that's kind of, it's better than the one that was, the piece that was on the end. I guess that is bright and coppery. Maybe it's the shadow that I was seeing. Okay. But if you have that kind of tarnish on the end of your wire there, and you've got the opportunity, if you've got enough to cut it back and get some good wire to do it. And that tarnish does, over time, stop conducting electricity. Another quick point here. So I had another wire that was going to go on this switch here, and I really can't fit 4 terminals on here. But then I realized these are the wires going to my gauges. I have a gray and blue, a gray and brown, and then I realized I've also got the fuel gauge here, which is gray and orange. And it dawned on me, really, I can run one wire from the ignition switch up there to the gauge cluster and do the same thing I did here with the jumper wires for power, and I can jumper the power between the gauges, and that would probably work more effectively. And so I may end up pulling this fuel gauge wire off, and I'll just have this one blue and this one gray and blue wire from the for the water temp. I'll probably run that one to the water temp gauge, and then piggyback off of that for all the other gauges, because really they don't draw a whole lot of power, and you just need to feed power to your gauges, and then you ground them through the sensors, and that's how your gauges work. So I'll probably take this one off and just run it. Matter of fact, I'm going to do that now. I'm going to take that off and I'm going to run it from up there.